The Kvetun Solothurn is an interesting sword and kind of difficult to review. It was originally made as a museum reproduction, trying to make something as close to the real historical thing as possible, with a HEMA version coming later, meant to be a little bit safer and slightly more cost-effective. The closest equivalent sword to this is the Regeni Parrot sword, also made one-to-one, replicating a museum piece to get that little bit of history in your hands. The Solothurn is also pretty expensive, over $500 after shipping, putting it in equivalent to something like a Pavel Mach or Siki King. The goal of the sword was to make a good reproduction, not necessarily make the best tool for modern sparring. So how did they do? Let's start with the build. How's the quality, how's the flex, and how's the sword actually built? In general, this is a high quality feather. Lots of tight tolerances and good materials used throughout. There were a couple of leftover manufacturing marks, and the stitching on the handle wasn't exactly straight, but that's not that bad. It's fairly similar to a Pavel Mach Type C. It's a bit lighter, but compared to something like a Sigi or a Krieger, it's on the heavyweight side. It also has a really long blade, over 100 centimeters, although the handle is much shorter than a Pavel Mach. Both swords also have an extremely wide blade, which I quite like. The biggest difference and the biggest safety concern comes with the tip. Pavel, super swelled and safe. The Solothurn, quite narrow even though it is really wide. I don't own a scale, so you have to trust me on this one. The flex is really good. It's equivalent to a Pavel Mach Type C, a notoriously floppy feather, so even though the tip may be less safe, the flex definitely isn't. After a few weeks of sparring, the leather handle has held up surprisingly well. No big nicks or gouges. The metal, on the other hand, picks up rust fast, so you'll have to clean the sword often. The feel of a sword is oftentimes the most difficult thing to convey via video, but I'll try my best. The odd, short-waisted grip is very weird when you first grab it. I found myself holding the sword just above the waist with my first fingers, and then having the three right below it, and it's actually really comfortable. However, when I put on gloves, I tend to choke really far down and essentially grab it by the pommel. Although lighter than the Pavel, this sword really wants to cut. In my super unscientific drop test, we can see that the sword, 200 grams less than a Pavel Mach, wants to drop the tip immediately after letting go of it. The Pavel, even though heavier, has a longer handle and tends to slow down as I let go of it. The side-by-side is even more striking, seeing the Solothurn drop immediately and is significantly faster than the Pavel Mach. This tip heaviness translates into how you use it. This sword wants to keep moving. Stop cuts are not your friend here. We want to keep the sword flowing and moving around. I really like doing the big sweepy stuff, but this sword almost requires it. Whenever I hand off the sword for testing, my peers almost immediately find it tip heavy. Whenever they try to stop the sword, it wants to fight them.
Yeah, it just wants to go.
Yeah, that's the thing that you're saying, and it definitely is true. Any deviation from going straight forward is going to want to carry.
If you're used to lighter or not tip heavy feathers, this takes some getting used to once you actually start sparring. I experienced way more ground hits than I typically do with my Pavel Mach, although it's not too heavy where I can actually get some pretty good tip control with it. My peers did report that it felt like it hit harder than other swords, but it wasn't a significant difference compared to other swords that are around in the bunch like Sigi Kings. This cuttiness makes it really fun to actually flow and swing around. It also helps you take the center line against lighter swords. This cuttiness is also a pretty big drawback. Peers with faster swords or who catch you in the motion can really easily exploit this slower tip-heavy sword, and I found myself getting beamed in the middle of actions quite often by my peers. So that brings us to our conclusion. Should you buy a replica feather in this sea of choices with nice, safe options all over the internet? I'd sum it up this way. This sword is for history nerds, for folks who want to imagine themselves fencing alongside Meyer holding a piece of history in their hands. Not for people who want to have a very first sword or a daily driver to use in tournaments. This might be off-putting to some, but if you're a giant nerd like me who likes to sit around in poofy pants poring over treatises, this sword might actually be for you.
I'm doing HEMA, everybody.